This is a presentation on Sahelian Scripture. It's intended for those who are not familiar with the writing systems of Africa, West Africa especially. The Sahel is an Arabic word that means shore, and it refers to the desert shore, the shore of the Sahara, where the vast desert of the Sahara meets the savanna in West Africa, which functions kind of like a shore. So in this zone in West Africa, there are many very interesting cultures, and they are cultures with ancient literacy that is different than the literacy of the West. So this is intended for those who are not really familiar with this kind of writing and with the history of literacy in West Africa, particularly people living in the United States and Western Europe. I'm drawing a lot here from Jean-Michel Dijan's The Manuscripts of Timbuktu, which I will be citing, giving you some samples of. It's a wonderful text that has many beautiful illustrations in it from Africa World Press, published in 2020, and it's very affordable for a book that's so beautifully illustrated with photographs and samples akin to those that I'm going to be giving you here. Here I'll just give you two or three excerpts from this text and talk about the literature of the Sahel more generally, which is based effectively in Timbuktu, although there are many other libraries besides Timbuktu in the Sahel that have these ancient manuscripts that are discussed in this text. Now, just to give some background here, there are three, historically speaking, there are far more dynasties than the three that I mentioned here: the Ghana dynasty, the Mande dynasty, the Songhay dynasty. But I draw attention to these dynasties in particular because of the role that literacy plays within them. Now, the oldest of the three dynasties is the Ghana dynasty. As you can see here, these are some rough dates, 300 to 1200. And the nobles of these dynasties were the Soninke, and the Soninke people, who were also, and in the case of the Songhay, sometimes referred to as the Wakuri, and they were the nobles of all of these dynasties in effect. The Mande dynasty, as you can see here, dates from 1235 to 1600. The Songhay dynasty from 1464 to 1591. In effect, these were all manifestations of the same dynasty, and that took different forms with people who were related to one another and who were literate and who used literacy in order to consolidate consolidate the power of the dynasties, but also to administer the dynasties as well in a bureaucratic sense. Now you can see here on this map, you can see where Timbuktu is, and Djenné. These are also great site. Djenné is also another great site of learning with vast libraries as well, and both of them, as well as Gao, which became the capital of the Songhay dynasty, are located on the Niger River in West Africa. Okay, let me continue. So you can see here the Mali Empire, the Mande dynasty. You can see where this was the one that preceded the Songhay dynasty and came after the Ghana dynasty. Ghana is, by the way, not to be confused with the modern day state of Ghana. And then the Songhay Empire, as you can see, of the Askia Muhammad and the dynasty of the Asiyas, also of Sunni Ali Bur. You can see where it's located here. These are just rough areas to show you the expanse that these dynasties cover. And note that one of the things that the Mande dynasty and the Songhay dynasty have in common is that they're based along the Niger River, and the Niger, called in this context the Joliba, which literally means the river of the griots. Niger was the word that the colonizers gave to this river, but it has a much older name, which is the Joliba. And these are like the cultures of the Nile in Egypt, or we could even speak of the Mississippi in the United States, or as does Langston Hughes addresses this, or the Amazon. These are river cultures that are formed along the river, and the river functioned, in this case, the Joliba in Niger, functioned as a kind of a super highway that held the dynasties together and allowed transport of goods and information as well. But in addition to that, if you look up where you see Timbuktu and Gao, these are areas as you get, like, let's say as you go from Jinneh up to Timbuktu and Gao, these are more arid, deserty areas, but based along the river, you can grow rice, and these are places that are hospitable to human civilization. But you get a little further out, and it becomes a lot more arid and rocky. So naturally, these civilizations formed along the life-sustaining properties of the great river that bound them together. This presentation is focused on the question of literacy, not so much on questions of orality, but it's important to note that these are cultures also with great oral histories that were transmitted orally or mouth to ear by the griot. You can see here an illustration of a griot from a book by a traveler named Mungo Park, who we're going to be speaking about also, and who's an English traveler, actually from Scotland, but went on behalf of England to explore this part of West Africa. And in both cases, in the case of, say, the Mande Dynasty, the epic of Sundiata Keita, or sometimes called Sonjara, is the griot epic performed by the Mande griot that addresses the exploits of Sundiata Keita, who was the founder of this dynasty. Similarly, there are Songhay griots and Zarma griots that perform the epic of Asiyas Muhammad, who is the main cultural hero of the Songhay people in the founding of the Songhay Dynasty of the Asiyas, which was also followed by his sons like the Asiyas Daoud, the Asiyas Ishak, and others, his grandson, who also served as the sovereign of this Songhay state. I want to show you a little excerpt here. This is El Hadji Papa Susana. He's a Mande griot from Gambia. He has since passed away, but he came to Western Washington University on a number of occasions before his passing and performed for us. And this just gives you a little sample of what griot music sounds like. You can see there the hole in the kora, which is the place where one places money inside. We'll just listen to this for just a minute so you can see what this he would be, in this case, performing the Mande epic of Sundiata Keita. You can hear what it sounds like. Okay, I just wanted to give you a brief sample of that. And of course, there are other, you can go just Google the word griot music on YouTube. You can find many other really interesting samples of griot music. I just wanted to mention this in passing because when we think about the word in the Sahelian context, many of the critics, scholars call logocentrism, the Platonic logocentric notions about writing and speaking don't really apply in this context. Now, the word logos is the Greek word for speaking that gets transmitted in the European Western cultural traditions. In the case of West Africa, the word for word is nyama, which is the Mande word, but there are variants of this word, like the Fulfulde or from the Fulani, which is more an extended vowel, the Naxamala, the Songhay, Baraka. These are all synonyms for a similar kind of thinking of the word as a kind of a power. These are different ways of thinking about it: means, force, breath, saliva, sweat, urine, even feces, filth. Because what the word really is it is effectively construed as a kind of a fluid of the body. Now, as a bodily fluid, one that, say, the griot literally expectorates from mouth to ear, it's considered to be a substance of great power that one must be very careful about. And we could think about it if you want to compare it to something in the Western tradition, we could compare it to the Platonic thinking of the word as a kind of a pharmacon. It has a sort of it's like a medicinal property. It's not in itself either good nor evil, but neutral, depending upon how. It really depends upon how it's used. I showed you the little hole in the Korah of Papa Suso, and Haji Papa Suso, and that's one places money in the hole and says, "Take the niyama away," as if the griot who sings praises. The griot is a kind of a praise singer, also sings, praises your name. You place money in the hole because you're aware that this is a man of power, and the words that he speaks are indeed powerful, and one must be very careful about the spoken word, whether it's sung or written. Now, in the case of both the spoken word and the written word, when we're thinking about the word as niyama, or this kind of power, this powerful bodily fluid, it applies to both to speaking and writing. And so that's why I wanted to just take a brief moment to address the question of the griot, because when we think about West African writing, it's also like the word of the griot, considered to be something, a thing that exists in the empirical world that has great power within it. So here you can see some instances of amulets that are inscribed, and the inscriptions are akin to a kind of a magical formula. Now we could think of, for instance, if you've seen popular movies in the West about figures like Harry Potter movies, who learns to speak words and waves his wand and magical things can happen. It's somewhat similar to that, in the sense that these are not just signs that are the function of which is to signify, but rather they are powerful things in themselves. Okay, this is one way of thinking about the differences between the West African orientation to words, to say the spoken word, and European Western ways of thinking about literacy. Because in the Western tradition, say from at least Augustine onward, but also of course in Plato, the function of a sign, a written word, is to signify, but in itself it's empty. It has no significance. It signifies, and its meaning ceases after it performs its task of signifying. Or Augustine, for instance, in his On Christian Doctrine, is going to say a word is a thing that points to another thing. But in this case, in the case of the West African, we think about West African literacy or amulets. The inscribed word is a thing that points to another thing. It does serve the function of signifying, as does the word in the West, but its meaning is not exhausted by its signifying capacity. Okay, so another way to say that is that it is also meaningful in and of itself, not only for what it signifies, but for what it is. Now, amulets also, so they can serve a kind of a function of protecting you. And you can see here the child is wearing an amulet in the image at the top center, and then on the bottom left you see that's an image of Amadou Bamba, the founder of the Mouridia order in Senegal, and one wears this around one's neck in this case in order to protect you. So the amulet, it's a written formula that is also a powerful object that can protect you. And you can see here on the right at the top, one might carry these inscribed amulets inside of a pouch, and they serve the function of protection. Okay, now if you look down at the bottom, you see a man who is drinking an amulet, and this also can happen as well. One can inscribe something on a sheet of paper and then wash the ink into a basin like this and drink it, and then the power of that inscription will enter into the body. Now, this is a very, very ancient way of thinking about literacy, one that dates back to the time of the ancient Egyptians, but it's also one that is very much a part of the contemporary life of West African people today. So when we think about this different orientation to literacy, it's not something that is a matter of being a highly educated or not an educated person. It's not something that is simply a matter of superstition. It's just a different way of thinking about signs and what they are. And so I think we want to bear that in mind as we think about scripture in this context. These are some images here on the left. This is an image. This is a photograph of that I took at the Grand Marché in Bamako, and then on the right you see an image that I took in northern Mali in Bandiagara, and you see Quranic inscriptions on these boards. Now, what these boards are is children will learn to recite the Quran, in many cases the entire Quran, or at least 60 verses of it, and the Marabu, the teacher of the child, will inscribe surahs or passages, textual passages from the Quran on the board. And once the child has the surah memorized and can orally recite it, then the Marabu will scratch off the Quranic inscription of the surah, and then we'll write yet another one, and this process will go on until the child has the Quran memorized. And so we can think of many Muslims in the West African Sahelian context as being literally walking Qurans, because the Quran is something that is entirely memorized. And of course, the word Quran itself means oral recitation, as opposed to the Mus'haf, which is the written version of the Quran. But what's important to remember in this context is that the Quran, is something that is spoken and memorized and in effect embodied. So it's very different than, say, Protestant or Protestant Christian orientations to literacy, which are so bound to printed, industrial printed texts, for instance. It's just a very different way of thinking about the word, one that is, again, quite ancient. Now, here you can see, these are on the left, you can see some children with their Quranic boards, where they're being instructed by a Marabu to learn the Quran. And here on the right, this was a photograph I took in Dakar at the new historical museum of Black history in Dakar, in the room honoring El Hajj Omar Tal, the founder of the Tijani order. And these are, again, you can see here, Quranic inscriptions on these boards. Okay, so let's put this in historical context. So as John Hunwick, the great scholar of West African literacy, observes, he recently passed away, but he's one of the most important figures in the history of Sahelian scholarship, who dedicated his life to the study of the manuscripts of Timbuktu. And he stated, it should not be forgotten that the first Arabic printing press on the African continent was one which Napoleon brought with him to Egypt in 1798. In North Africa, a few books were lithographed in Fez, this is in Morocco, before this date, but the flow of multiple copies of books from either source is basically a phenomenon of the second half of the 19th century. Okay, so that's something that gives us a pause. And so we can say, when we want to think about, for instance, the encounter between the Western world, or Europe, and West Africa with respect to the question of literacy, one of the key differences is that many of the first travelers, like Mungo Park, who came to West Africa to explore it, and for other reasons, were there. And when they encountered this different orientation to literacy, they were very mystified by it, because by this point, the printing press had been around for a very long time in Europe, and there was a very different orientation to literacy had developed. Now you can see here a image of, there's Gutenberg, who in the 15th century invented the printing press, and you can see what the printing press looks like here, and the little block letters that one puts on the press and then smears it with ink and flattens the piece of paper on top of it. Now let's note that it very quickly after the invention of the printing press comes into being, Protestant Christianity comes into being. Martin Luther, the great reformer in the Lutheran tradition, in the Reformed, in the Reformation that took place in Europe. He didn't just nail these theses to the Wittenberg door, in his protest of the Catholic Church and what he perceived to be, corruptions within the church that needed reformation. But he also translated the entire Bible into German, which was then distributed to the masses who could then read it themselves. And so when we think of Protestant Christianity, for instance, we're thinking about an orientation to Christianity that embodies a kind of literacy that is linked to the historically speaking, to the invention of the printing press. And this kind of thinking about Scripture as something that is, that exists in a book that can be mass produced, it's not the same kind of orientation to literacy that exists in West Africa. So we can say, well, one of the key differences between in colonial encounter, if we're thinking about this in terms of literacy, when some of these Europeans first came into West Africa during the colonial period, is that they had a very different way of thinking about words that was shaped by their experience of the printing press. Walter Ong, who is a theorist of orality literacy differences, observes that with the invention of the printing press, there comes to be a thinking of the word that as an object or having a thing-like character that is really not the case so much in the world that these travelers encountered. And so here you can see Mungo Park. He lived from 1771 to 1806. He traveled to West Africa twice, came back, wrote his travels, which were published in 1799. On his second trip to West Africa, he was killed. He did not make it back, although his notes were published later. Now here you can see, here's Park. He's reflecting upon this kind of literacy that he encounters as a Protestant Christian from England, which leaves him somewhat befuddled. Now you can see his language is obviously racist and imperialistic. He's coming on an imperial venture. However, we want to focus, for the purposes of our discussion today, strictly on questions of literacy and the different orientation to literacy in this encounter, and what, say, a scholar like Mary Louise Pratt, who studies the imperial literature, calls the contact zone, the zone of contact between the European and the person, the indigenous person in West Africa. Notwithstanding the majority of the Negroes are pagans and absolutely reject the doctrines of Muhammad, I did not meet with a man, whether a Bushreen or Kafir, who was not fully persuaded of the powerful efficacy of amulets. These safis are prayers, or rather sentences from the Quran, which the Mohammedan priests write on scraps of paper and sell to the simple natives, who consider them to possess very extraordinary virtues. All the natives of this part of Africa consider the art of writing as bordering on magic, and it is not in the doctrines of the prophet, but in the arts of the magician that their confidence is placed. And so this is Park reporting on. Now he's obviously quite ignorant here in his understanding of the culture that he's encountering. He refers to the Muslim marabouts that he meets as Mohammedan priests. It's an obvious Christianizing that is inaccurate. However, what's important to note here is he's suggesting that whether you're a Muslim or whether you're not a Muslim, everybody has an orientation to thinking about writing as he says here, that's bordering on magic, that's not in the doctrines of the prophet, but in the arts of the magician. And there is some truth to this, because the kind of what he's calling magic here is really linked to this much older pre-Islamic culture that has historical connections to the civilization of ancient Egypt that far precedes the coming of Islam to West Africa. And so, for instance, as we're going to discuss, Islam comes to West Africa in about the year 1000, or say 400 years after the death of the Prophet Muhammad, or maybe 300 years is probably more accurate. But in any case, when it comes into a world that is a very ancient world, and which has been influenced by ancient Egypt, and which has a very different way of thinking about literacy that differs not only from the Christian West, but from the Arabian Islamic world, which then begins to, when these doctrines begin to spread. And so the Islamic doctrines, that is. And so there develops a kind of a syncretism of Sahelian and Islamic ways of thinking about literacy. But the older cultural substratum, continues to persist. Okay, here's Park. He says, when I observed any person whose countenance I thought bore malice to me, I made it a rule to ask him either to write in the sand himself or to decipher what I had already written. And the pride of his showing his superior attainments generally induced him to comply with my request. And then he says, here's another quote from his travels. I observed with pleasure the great docility and submissive deportment of the children, and heartily wished they had better instructors in a pure religion. It is sure that the introduction of the printed book will soften and civilize the African mind. Well, Park is completely mistaken in this idea. However, he is noting again, he's observing these Quranic schools where children learn to memorize the Quran by writing on these planks, learning these surahs, and he sees how he calls them docile and submissive, but also how they're able to memorize so much is astonishing to him, because this is an oral culture as well as a literate culture in which memory is very powerful, as in the case of the Griot, who has this powerful memory as well. And Park is convinced that the printed book is going to transform this culture, and he'll go, when he goes back to England, he'll recommend that the Quran be printed on these industrial printed books, much like the Protestant Bible, and then be distributed, and this will have a missionizing effect. At least this is what he thinks. Now here you can see again, here you can see a man inscribing on a tablet surahs from the Quran. You can see down there below, this is again another image that I took from the Grand Market and Grand Marché in Bamako, where these tablets are sold. And then here you can see these industrial printed block letters. And so Park we can think of him as a kind of a bookman, a man whose orientation to literacy is shaped by the industrial printed mass-produced book. And he's coming into a world where literacy has a very different. People think about literacy in very different ways, and there's a kind of a disconnect that happens in this encounter. Here's Park again. He says, when a Moorish boy has committed to memory a few of their prayers and can read and write certain parts of the Quran, he is reckoned sufficiently instructed, and with this slender stock of learning commences his career of life, boasting an advantage over the Negroes by possessing, though in a very limited degree, the knowledge of letters. The Moors are at once the vainest and proudest, and perhaps most bigoted and ferocious and intolerant of all the nations on earth, combining in their character the blind superstition of the Negroes with the savage cruelty and treachery of the Arabs. Okay, now here we get a glimpse into Park's obvious racism. Note again, the Moors we say the Moors, the Berbers, or the Tuareg, and the Tuareg of the Sahel were often fiercely opposed to imperialism, and the Europeans, the French and British alike, viewed the Tuareg, or what Park is calling the Moors, as proposing one of the biggest obstacles to the colonization of this region. But we see here, I draw your attention to this because he's creating a kind of a hierarchy of superiority that's not only based on skin color or phenotype or manifest appearance, but also on literacy. And he places him, of course, himself at the top of this hierarchy, the so-called Moor beneath that, and then the Negro beneath that, or what he's calling the Negro. And he would place, I'm sure he would place the Arab before the Moor. So his way of thinking is not only racist, it's also his racism is informed by his orientation to literacy, and that is a point I'd like to observe, because racism is a terrible thing, of course, but also it's this notion that a person who is, well, as he considers to be illiterate, is also because if you look up historically, synonyms with illiteracy are stupidity, idiocy, so forth and so on, that people who are considered to be illiterate are also experience various forms of prejudice as well. Now, historically speaking, there is a kind of a false stereotype about West Africa that it had no writing at all, and so this false stereotype, because writing has always been in Africa. As long as there has been writing comes from Africa, but it played into a kind of an imperializing mandate, and that's what I would like to draw your attention to here. Okay, now here's part, perhaps a short and easy introduction to Christianity, such as is found in some catechisms for children, elegantly printed in Arabic and distributed on different parts of the coast, might have a wonderful effect. The expense would be trifling. Curiosity would induce many to read it, and the evident superiority which it would possess over their present manuscripts, both in point of elegance and cheapness, might at last obtain it a place among the school books of Africa. And so here's, as you can see, he totally misunderstands the way in which people in the Sahel think about literacy. And so he imagines that if these industrial printed books are produced, that it'll be a way to win over the native population. Now, to Christianity, specifically Protestant Christianity. Now, 50 years later, a traveler named James Richardson will come from England, will come to West Africa, and he will follow Park's advice, and he will bring with him these industrial printed books in Arabic, and he will distribute them. But to his surprise, he'll find that nobody wants them. And part of the reason why nobody wants them, in addition to the fact that he's distributing Arabic translations of the Gospels, which people aren't particularly interested in, but also the fact that they are industrially printed in the first place, rather than inscribed by a particular person or marabou, renders them of no interest. And let's read what this is from Richardson's travels. Richardson, by the way, like Park, died in his travels. He didn't make it back, but his motivation for coming was imperialist, but he was also an abolitionist, and was there seeking to eradicate the slave trade. So here's Richardson. It says, he offered an Arabic New Testament to a Moor named Safaxi, and Richardson notes, he read a few sentences and then laid the book aside. I offered it to him, but he refused to accept the inestimable present. Safaxi represents the feelings of all Muslims in these countries. They have not even any curiosity to know the contents of the gospel, much less the inclination to study or appreciate them. They remain in a state of immovable, absolute indifference. Even the beautiful manner in which the Arabic letters are printed scarcely excites their surprise. So Richardson he's simply unable to he can't figure out why nobody wants these books that he's distributing. Now, part of the reason for this, of course, is that Islam, comes after Christianity. The Quran has a very strong critique of the Christian religion, particularly the Christian doctrine of the Trinity, and the idea that, Jesus is, of course, the prophet in Islam. The prophet Isa is a very important prophet, but the Islamic tradition also rejects the doctrine of incarnation, or the notion that the prophet Jesus was, in effect, a man was in effect a god. And so Islam, historically speaking, the Christian missionaries in Africa had much more success in areas that had not previously come into contact with Muslims. And so in the Islamic world, Christianity almost never was successful in gaining any traction, or if it did, in very small places, very, very limited, success. Again, part of this is that the Islamic tradition has already has a narrative about Christianity, a critique of Christianity embedded in the Quran, but also again, what I want to draw attention to here is the difference between the book that is printed and the book that is handwritten. The book that is handwritten, again, is significant not only because of what it signifies, but for what it is in itself as an object, that the significance of which is not exhausted by its signifying function. That's the point that I would like to make. Okay. Now, Sheikh Anta Diop is an important Senegalese scientist and thinker, Egyptologist. He lived from 1923 to 1986. He wrote a number of influential books like Pre-Colonial Black Africa, The African Origin of Civilization, and then Ancient Egypt and Black Africa in 1989. The biggest university in Senegal, in Dakar, is named after him, Sheikh Anta Diop University in Dakar. He was a figure of major significance, and he was the one who first made the argument that West African civilization has a connection to the civilization of ancient Egypt. And I encourage you to learn more about Diop, who's a very interesting and important figure. But Diop's argument, as you can see here in this map on the left, this image of Africa, when we think of the time of ancient Egypt, we're thinking of a time also when the Sahara was not simply a great desert, but it was a savanna as well that was much easier to travel. Now, the Tuareg, or what Park's calling the Moor, also traveled freely throughout the Sahara, even after the desertification set in. But if we're thinking about Diop's argument, the civilization of ancient Egypt would have been diffused throughout West Africa and throughout Africa more generally, not only West Africa. And this is not, at the time, it was a very controversial thesis. Now it's considered by many to be common knowledge. It's certainly embraced in the West African context, Diop's argument. And this shouldn't surprise us. We, for instance, I mentioned earlier the Greek concept of the logos, providing the philosophical foundation of Western orientations to the word, the thinking of the logos, say, introduced in Plato's, Timaeus or Phaedrus some 400 years before the birth of Christ. And it's very common in the West to say Western orientations to literacy have a Platonic, Hellenic, ancient Greek origin. So it shouldn't surprise us then also to consider that ancient Egypt, which was a very old civilization indeed, far older than the civilization of ancient Egypt, would have also influenced the culture of West Africa. It had a wide distribution, ways of thinking about the word, which are not the same exactly as those in West Africa, but are certainly similar. And Diop's thesis is that there are obvious questions of cultural transmission or diffusion at work. Now, on the right, you see an image of Thoth there with his writing implement. This is the famous scene from the Egyptian Book of the Dead. But Thoth, even Plato in his Phaedrus, observes that Thoth is even for the Greeks, was construed as the inventor of writing. So Thoth is the Egyptian god who invents writing. And I want to observe here that writing itself, alphabetic literacy that enters into Europe, comes from Africa. It comes from ancient Egypt. Now here you can see an image of Thoth, and if you look at the letters, like let me draw your attention to the N in the middle there in the column. You can see that the Egyptian hieroglyph for the N, or the sound of the N, would be a snake. And as it becomes more abstracted and the sound, the image becomes something that is more, a sign that points to a sound rather than to a thing in the ontological world, it nonetheless has this pictorial hieroglyphic origin. If you look below it, you see the I evolves and it becomes an O. Well, literacy comes into Greek culture, into Europe through ancient Egypt. And this way of thinking about words or letters, in this case, we can see here the evil eye amulet in the middle, or the hand of Fatima amulet there on the far right. That these are all these Egyptian signs. They are signs in the alphabetic sense, that they, as in things that point to sounds, but they also have, we could say, as I said previously, let me repeat it again, their significance is not exhausted by their signifying function, because they're also significant not just as signs, but for what they are. Not just because they represent a sound, for instance, like you can look at the Coptic cross there, which becomes the T. It does point to the sound of the T, the T sound, but it also is significant in and of itself as an amulet that is imbued with power. Now, the Greek word for this power that is imbued in the amulet is heka, which etymologically is the word that we get magic from. It's very similar to this term nyama, which I mentioned previously, which is also a way of thinking about the word as a kind of a power, having a kind of an occult power embedded, within it. Okay, so now when we think about Islam, however, Islam comes into the world. We could say one of the things we could say about Islam, and I'm speaking very generally, is that like Christianity, it is a religion that is that comes into the world after the Hellenic civilization or colonization, I should say, of much of the ancient Mediterranean. For instance, Alexander the Great is mentioned in the Quran, who was the pupil of Aristotle, and Aristotle was the pupil of Plato. Plato was the pupil of Socrates, and it's Alexander the Great is considered by some Muslims in West Africa to be, in effect, a prophet, and so we can think of of Islam as coming into a world that has already been effectively Hellenized, or which the encounter with the Hellenic world has already occurred. And so when the Quran comes into West Africa and Islam is spread throughout West Africa, one way of talking about this is that it also brings in a kind of a Hellenic influence as well that had not previously been in this region. And so there is a kind of a conflict that comes to be that we could think of in terms of ways of thinking about literacy when this very, very ancient Egypto-African orientation to the word comes into contact or encounter with a way of thinking about the word, which is, I'm not saying that the Quranic way of thinking about the word is Hellenic, but it is more logocentric in the sense that there is a notion of a word as being like the doctrine in the Islamic tradition of the heavenly book, of the word being like, in the case of the Christian tradition, uncreated, co-eternal with God. And that is a more, let's say, even metaphysical, transcendental way of thinking about the word that we don't find in the West African tradition, which is much more linked to this more Egyptian way of thinking about the word as this kind of powerful force in the world. But as Islam comes into this region, a syncretic orientation to literacy develops. So it's not really an either or, it becomes effectively a kind of a both and. Now, putting it in historical context, we can see here the Mande civilization, the empire dynasty of Sundiata Keita around 800 years ago in what is today modern day Mali area region, southern Mali. The Songhay would be more northern Mali, and it comes after the Mande dynasty. But these are Islamic kingdoms, but they're Islamic interpretations of Islam that are also informed by this far older, Sahelian civilization that predates the coming of Islam. There's a very prominent proverb by the Songhay that says, if a log Paul Stoller, the prominent American anthropologist who studied the Songhay people for many years, quotes this often in his research. It goes something like this: if a log floats in the water for 1,000 years, it doesn't become a crocodile. And that's, we can think of, well, if Islam has been in West Africa for 1,000 years, if it's been floating in this water for 1,000 years, a log is still a log. It's not a crocodile. And so the orientation to Islam, the orientation to the Quran that develops in the Sahel is one that is very different from other parts of the Islamic world. And in fact, when we look at, say, some of the conflicts that occurred in northern Mali in the taking of Timbuktu by Islamic militants that were Wahhabi or Salafist in their orientation to Islam, many of these more militant Muslims who are influenced by Arabian orientations to Islam perceive West African orientations to Islam to be heretical. And this is a source, historically, this has been a source of conflict, and that conflict is ongoing into the present. The Mandate Charter, there you can see Sundiata Keita, he ruled from 1190 to 1255. Epic of Sonjara by John Williams Johnson is perhaps the best that I know of transcription of the Griot epic that is about his rise to power. Although there were other versions as well, because the griots, like Alhaji Papa Suso, have performed have sung his praises for many hundreds of years. But I want to draw your attention here again to this. We're focused on questions of literacy, to the Mandate Charter, which was written in 1236. Now, this was a charter which is along with the Magna Carta, written in England, one of the oldest documents. It is the oldest document besides the Magna Carta of human rights in existence. And so if we put it in universal human rights, so we put it in context, the Magna Carta only appeared, some 20 years earlier in England, which is also a document that articulates human rights. Famous habeas corpus is there, those rights of that nature. The Declaration of Independence, 1776. The Declaration of the Rights of Man and the Citizen in France, 1789. But long before, in again 1236, the Mandate had already written a document of the rights of its citizens, and indeed of all peoples, of all human beings. So let's look. I just pulled out a few articles here from this charter that was written so long ago. Article number 9: children's education behooves or is necessary. It's necessary that the entire society attend to the education of children. The paternal authority in consequence falls to everyone. Here's another one, Article 14: never offend women or mothers. Article 16: women, apart from their everyday occupations, should be associated with all our managements. Article number 19: any man has two parents in law. We have to hold them in respect and consideration. Article 20: do not ill-treat the slaves. We are the master of the slave, but not the bag he carries. Article 23: never betray one another. Respect your word of honor. Article 24: in Mandan, do not mistreat the foreigners. Okay, so we've seen already here articles dealing with the question of the rights of women, the rights of children, the rights of slaves as well. These were slave-holding societies. But this Article 24 is interesting because, again, it anticipates the Kantian universal human right of hospitality, which is so important in the UN Charter today, the universal human right of hospitality. Article 25, the ambassador does not risk anything in Mandan. So if you're a foreign ambassador from another land, you have safety in Mandate society. Article 40, respect kinship, marriage, and the neighborhood. Article 41, you can kill the enemy, but not humiliate him. This anticipates, the rights in the Enlightenment period in Europe of, during times of warfare, that there are, limitations to how one can treat the enemy. Article 42. In big assemblies, be satisfied with your lawful representatives. Article 44. All those who transgress these rules will be punished. Everyone is bound to make effective their implementation. Okay, so this Article 44 is important because it implies, much like in Rousseau's social contract, this notion that a law is not a law unless it's backed up by force. And so these are laws. They're not just principles. They're laws that are enforced. Okay, I want to, though, focus for now on the question of the Songhay. And in the case of this particular empire, this is the empire which I think, for our purposes of discussing Sahelian scripture, is so important because Timbuktu became such a center of learning and became a repository of so many manuscripts. Now, there are other manuscripts throughout in places, in cities and towns throughout the Sahel, but Timbuktu especially was a great university town, and so many manuscripts were housed there and were produced there and were disseminated throughout the Islamic world from Timbuktu. Now, if we look at the people, I wanted to just give you some image of what the peoples of Timbuktu look like. These are just a few, but two of the main ethnic groups of the Songhay are the Tuareg. Now, the Tuareg, if you can see it in the far right, they're known as the blue men of West Africa. They're on the far right. You see the Tuareg men. Below that, you see Tuareg women. They are of Moorish or Berber ancestry. The Tuareg are the founders of Timbuktu. It was named for one of their servants who was stationed there, and the city flourished around this particular spot as established by the Tuareg. The Songhay also have lived historically with the Tuareg. In the case of the Songhay Dynasty of Asiyas Muhammad, they were the Songhay who ruled, but the Songhay and the Tuareg lived side by side, and both of them were highly literate peoples as well. Okay, here's an image of the Sankore Mosque and Madrasa at Timbuktu. Now, at the site of the Sankore Mosque in the Sankore neighborhood, madrasa is a word that means like a school. So this was a center of great learning where people from all over the region, all over, including Northern Africa and beyond, would come in order to get an education. One of the most important documents that we have today is the Tariq Al fattash, which was written by Hajj Mahmud Kati, who was Songhay. And as you can see here, the Tariq Al fattash recounts the history of the Songhay Dynasty of the Asiyas from 1493 to 1599. It was written not only by Kati, but also by his ancestors who compiled his notes and edited them and produced this document, which the full title of which is The Chronicle of the Seeker, serving as an account of the towns, armies, and leading figures of the Takur, which is another word for this region. The Takur was an older, even a kingdom even older than the Songhay kingdom. But in any case, you can see there on the far left the original Tariq Al fattash inscribed in Arabic. Now, in the case of Kati, his father, interestingly enough, migrated from Spain after the Christians drove out the Muslims and the Jews and forced everybody who remained to either convert or to be burned at the stake. Well, Kati's father migrated. He married a Songhay woman, and Kati was the product of that union. So if you go to the library, the Kati family libraries in Timbuktu today, you'll see manuscripts even in Spanish as well as in Arabic, written by the father of Kati. The Tariq Al fattash that you see in the middle was the first translation in a European language that appeared about 100 years ago in France by Hudas and Delafosse. And interestingly enough, it didn't appear in English until very recently. The Tariq Al fattash, the Timbuktu Chronicles, is available from Africa World Press, and you can read it now in English from this great writer who is buried in Timbuktu today, and his grave remains a site that people go to, and he remains a venerated figure. But he was a personal friend of the Asiyas Muhammad who accompanied him on his Hajj to Mecca. So it provides a very fascinating glimpse of of what it was like. You can see here 1492 is the year Columbus sailed to America. So this was indeed a long time ago, and it provides a fascinating glimpse of a very ancient and highly developed civilization. Here's a description. After Timbuktu was destroyed or sacked by the Moroccans coming from the north, the author of the Tarikh, in this case, is ruminating on sort of the good old days of what it was like prior to its destruction. He says, let me just give you a little glimpse of what it was like. He says, to return again to the subject of Timbuktu, due to the peace, calm, and safety that God had bestowed upon its inhabitants, one might come across 100 of its townsfolk who had neither spear nor sword nor knife nor any other thing than a staff. There were around 150 schools in Timbuktu where young boys were taught to read the Quran, or 180 schools according to the Sheikh Muhammad ibn Ahmed. The same narrator added, my glance happened to fall on the writing planks of the schoolboys, which were dispersed throughout the courtyard of the house. I counted 123 of these planks, and I realized that the entire Quran was contained on these writing planks. The marvels and splendors of Timbuktu at this time were so great that one could not possibly enumerate them all. Even the most faithful memory would not know how to preserve the records of these things. So indeed, there are other descriptions of the splendors of Timbuktu, and to give you a sense of how the greatness of its libraries and its centers of learning. But this, I hope, gives you just a little glimpse into what was going on in Timbuktu some 500 years ago. So again, so this notion that Africa is a place without writing is simply a racist and false image. This is a very old culture and a very old culture of literacy, and indeed literacy itself comes from Africa. Okay, now here's another, at least in the Hellenic world, it comes to the Hellenic world, to Europe from Africa. This is the Tariq Al Sudan was written around the same time as the Tariq Al Fattash. Indeed, Kati is mentioned in the Tariq Al Sudan as a contemporary of Al Sadi, and he was a Berber. So again, this gives you a sense of the sort of the cultural diversity. He would be more like the Tuareg as opposed to Kati, who was Songhay. But he tells he recounts much of the same history that Kati recounts in the Tariq Al Fattash. Now, this the original, you can see there again on the far left, the original Tariq Al Sudan written in Arabic. You can see the Hudas version of it that appeared in 1900 in French, and then John Hunwick, the great scholar who I mentioned earlier, he published an English language translation of the Tariq Al Sudan in 1999. And so today in English, you can read both, in addition to Dijan's wonderful book that has so many nice images and samples from these manuscripts. You can also read the entire Tariq Al Fattash in English from Africa World Press, or you can read from Brill. You can read Hunwick's translation of this history from Al-Sadi, the Berber historian, that was published in 1999. Okay, now I want to mention in the same connection Ajame. Now there in the middle is Falu Ngom. He is a very prominent scholar of Ajame who heads the Ajame archive project, digitalization project at Boston University, who has gathered thousands of manuscripts in Ajame and digitalize them. You can Google Boston University and go to the and Ajame, and then go to the website. You can see many samples of Ajame writing. Now, what Ajame is it is African languages that are transcribed with an Arabic alphabet. So, in the case of Senegal, where Falus Ngom's research is based, much of the Ajame is in Wolof. But if you go to southern Senegal in the Casamance region, there's also a lot of Mande, Soninke, Ajame as well, and throughout Mali and other places in northern Nigeria, in the Hausa regions, there's a great deal of Ajami. And so it could be Mande, it could be Soninke, it could be Wolof, it could be Hausa, Fulfulde. There are many, many different African languages that have been alphabetized with Ajami. Now, when the French, for instance, colonized West Africa, they dismissed much of this writing as, bad Arabic, simply because they weren't able to read it. In fact, it's just as complex. I mean, for instance, Latin. The Latin alphabet gives us, from the Latin alphabet, we get the French alphabet, we get the Italian alphabet, we get the Spanish alphabet. A person, might be able to read Italian and not be able to read Latin or French, but they have the same, common historical origin. And so, as Ngom points out in much of his research, this is a literacy that long predates the coming of European colonial figures like Mungo Park, who come with this more alphabetic, movable type printing press orientation to literacy, and it's very prominent today. There are many people who have Ajami literacy. They often get mistakenly described as being illiterate, and even in documents like for UNESCO or the UN. But in fact, they're deeply literate. And so this is exciting research that Professor Ngom at Boston University is performing as he's documenting the vast extent of this Ajami literacy. And indeed, you'll find the same kind of literacy in Timbuktu as well. So it's not just an Arabic language literacy we're talking about. We're talking about African languages that have been alphabetized with an Arabic script. Okay, so when you're talking about Timbuktu, and I'm not talking about Flu Ngom's Ajami project here, I'm just talking about, let's say, Mali, linked to the Songhay Dynasty of the Asiyas. We know today that there's some 300,000 to 900,000 manuscripts. Many of these manuscripts are hidden away. Part of the reason why they're hidden is because when the French came to West Africa in the 19th century, they would bring back many of these manuscripts. A lot of them are housed at the Bibliothèque Nationale in France, and so people hid them for fear that they would be stolen. And even today, many Malians and other people who live in West Africa are quite reluctant to bring out these manuscripts for fear of what will happen to them. But Abdel Kader Hadara, you can see there on the far right, has been instrumental in gathering many of these manuscripts and bringing them to the Ahmed Baba Library in Timbuktu. There's an interesting book entitled The Badass Librarians of Timbuktu, which documents how he was able to save many of these manuscripts from their destruction by the jihadists who invaded Timbuktu in 2012. After Azawad, which is the name of this state that they gave, and before they were driven out of Timbuktu, some of them were indeed destroyed, but many of them, thanks to Hadara, were in fact saved. But that's a fascinating book. And again, the project of finding these, documenting them, and then digitalizing them is still something that's going on today. And so I gave you these examples of the Tariq al-Fattash, Tariq Al Sudan, and then Dijan's text, Manuscripts of Timbuktu, shows many samples of these manuscripts. However, the project of beginning to translate these manuscripts and finding out what they contain is really only just beginning. And so it's very exciting, the discoveries that are being made in these manuscripts of knowledge that has hitherto been completely unknown. Now, these are some types of manuscripts that you may find today at Timbuktu that I'd like to just mention here. These are just to give you a broad sense of what is contained in these manuscripts. There are Qurans, which is, of course, the revealed word given by the angel Gabriel to the Prophet Muhammad, and then later written down. The Hadith, which are the sayings of the Prophet Muhammad. There's many other forms of religious literature as well that you'll find in Timbuktu. Now, there's historiography like the Tariq al-Fattash, Tariq al Sudan, these histories myths, like the myths of Alexander the Great, for instance, legends that you'll find, interesting stories. There are legal and political documents. There are medical documents, documents addressing questions of astronomy, philosophy, even sex manuals. There are manuals. There are manuals for dream interpretation as well. And of course, there are plenty of amulets or these magical texts as well. In addition, there's one of the more important things is the marginalia. Now, if you look at the image on the right at the bottom of the man holding the Quran, you can see inscriptions in the margins, and oftentimes these margins will contain very interesting information that is also historical in character, as say somebody that would be commenting upon the text will write, and so sometimes the margins, what is included in the margins, are just as important as what's included in the actual text itself. Okay, here's an example on political governance. This example is by Al-Maghali, is on the sound principles of governance. He was an advisor to the Asiyas Muhammad in the 15th and 16th century. Dijan in the Manuscripts of Timbuktu compares this to Machiavelli's The Prince. It's a document which gives advice to the sovereign, the Asiyas, on how to manage or how to conduct himself as sovereign of the Songhay people. And here's from chapter 30 there are 30 chapters on good governance. And this is the introduction, in fact, that tells you what is contained in this text. It says, the contents of this work extend an invitation to the prince or sovereign to avoid the excesses of bad behavior and implore God to uphold him in his belief. So it is very akin to Machiavelli's The Prince, because it's written by an advisor to the king who's giving him advice on how to rule. It reminds him that rulers are earthly representatives of Allah. They are duty-bound to both spiritual and temporal powers. The virtues of the ruler are legion because he is the delegate of the prophet. The task that falls to him is quite heavy. For this reason, he should never cease to fear Allah and always bear in mind that death is certain. And again, that he will face, like in the Christian tradition as well, that after death he will face judgment for his actions. Here just gives you a little sample of some titles from this text. There's one chapter on good faith and why the sovereign must be virtuous. Chapter 2, why it is the king's duty to always dress in royal garb. Chapter 3, on the necessary measures to ensure his government is well organized. Chapter 4, on the vigilance that the monarch must exercise both at home and abroad. Chapter 5, why it is useful for the monarch to stay informed on all current affairs. Now here from chapter 6, I gave you, this is just one little example. You can get a sense of his prose on the necessity of impartiality in the ruler's decision. He writes, power walks upon the 2 feet of justice and goodness. Justice entails respecting the rights of each individual. Goodness consists of acting in a manner that is beyond reproach. The impartiality of the sovereign should be manifest whenever he is required to render judgment between 2 disputing parties. It is necessary to exercise justice when weighing the actions of opposed parties up to the final moment of decision. Even if one of the 2 parties seeks to reconcile, the ruler must remember that he is their judge, not their friend. Both parties should be granted the same amount of time to present their cases. Fairness demands that only those of sound moral character be allowed to stand as witnesses. So you can see there's some very interesting advice about how to exercise power, but to do it in a way that is just and fair. Okay, you also will find legal documents, for instance, fatwas and nazilas. Now, a fatwa is a legal opinion by a scholar of high repute. So it's a kind of someone will come to a scholar and ask him about what is a correct form of behavior. The scholar will give an opinion, which is that he'll render, which is a fatwa. A nazila is dealing with a calamity. So in this case, we're dealing with having to make a decision in a case that has no precedent, a particularly difficult kind of case. And there are some interesting examples of this when one comes up against very unusual situations. This is also something Dijan addresses in the Manuscripts of Timbuktu. Here from a text, this is a text from Sheikh Sidi Ahmed ibn Umar al-Rakadi al-Kunte, entitled The Treatment of Illnesses, Internal and External, which was written in 1552 of the Common Era, and the theme being on traditional medicine. Now, this manuscript's more than 300 pages, and it includes 5 different sections. And the introduction deals with the importance of health, the essential ingredient for success in all physical or intellectual activities. And then you get other chapters on the treatment of illnesses, using animal products, organs to heal, using plants, using minerals and rocks, and so forth. There's even sex manuals. I'll give you one example of this. This is about a sample dealing with the benefits of sexual intercourse. The author states, "It is common knowledge that to abstain from sex causes migraines and deliriums. It is proven that doing so causes heart palpitations, frigid temperatures, and gout. It blinds the heart. Do not doubt these words, but instead put them into actions. If you do so, you will succeed in all your endeavors. Among its benefits, you should know that it calms anger and often leads to the dissipation of worries and anxiety. In the same manner, copulating dissipates melancholy." Everyone knows this. It is commonly said that sexual desire chases away misfortune. At first, it hardens the heart, but it softens the heart once the act is completed. So you see, there are this. In this case, it's dealing with questions of sexuality, but they're just practical advice for maintaining good health, including issues of human sexuality. And I mentioned earlier Alexander the Great. There are stories about him and other figures that you'll find in the manuscripts of Timbuktu. There's astronomy, mathematics. You can see there the armillary sphere in the center. The armillary sphere is a way, it comes even straight from Plato's Timaeus. And indeed, the knowledge of Aristotle and Plato can be found in these manuscripts as well. Now, for further reading, again, I recommend John Hunwick, and there you can see a picture of him. His Tariq Al Sudan is a wonderful, such an important scholar. He's done so much. Falun Gong, you can see him there working with people in Senegal, gathering Jami manuscripts. He's written a really interesting book called Muslims Beyond the Arab World that documents the role of a Jame in African society, which has been so neglected by scholars up until the contributions of Falun Gong. And then Africa World Press, again, like Mahmud Kati's Tariq Al Fattash, and the Manuscripts of Timbuktu by Jean-Michel Dijan. These are both very affordable and make for quite interesting reading. And so that will conclude our discussion of Sahelian Scripture.